phone and it didn't get unmuted, so I think we didn't get the music on Zoom as she came out.
I
So
think
go ahead.
we're ready for you, Reverend Rica.
Thank you. Sorry about the mix-up. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm joining you from Berlin, Germany today, the city where I was born, where I grew up, and where I moved back to in the 2022. But many of you probably know that for a long time I actually lived in the US. In fact, I've preached in that beautiful sanctuary of yours on several occasions. And I have to say that right now I really miss the California sunshine. I always thought I was the first person in my family to visit the US, let alone live there. My parents hadn't been there before I moved there, and neither had my grandparents. Or so I thought. I mentioned this once to Tante Gerdi, Aunt Gerdi, my grandmother's younger sister, and she said, "Oh, but that's not true. Uncle Kurt spent 11 months in Nebraska." Uncle Kurt was her husband and had been my grandfather's best friend since they were young. He collected minerals, which he even let me play with when I was young, very carefully. And he always kept blackberry gumdrops in his shirt pockets for me whenever we came to visit. He also lived in East Germany until the wall fell. So however he made it to the US for 11 months, to Nebraska of all places, was a mystery to me. Tante Gerdi was quick to clear this up for me. Though highly critical of Hitler's regime, Uncle Kurt, like so many others, was drafted as soon as World War II started and stationed in Italy. There, he was captured by American soldiers and brought to the US as a prisoner of war. He was sent to labor on a farm in Nebraska. Now, by the time I found out about this, he had already died, so I never got to hear his recollection of that time. But according to his wife, Tante Gerdi, he actually remembered this time quite fondly. Yes, the work on the farm was hard, but the meals were hearty and plentiful. The beds in the barrack where he and the other German prisoners slept were warm and comfortable. And the farmer's family on whose farm they worked was friendly and welcoming. They had evenings and Sundays off, and during his free time, Uncle Kurt took a drawing class where he created pictures of exotic animals and birds, including a blue parrot that was just brilliant in its color, and he kept that all his life. I actually got to see that as a child. This was in stark contrast to the other relatives who were prisoners of war. My Uncle Max, for example, the third friend in that little trio of my grandfather, Uncle Kurt, and Uncle Max, he was sent to France, where the German soldiers were not even given houses, having to live in cold, wet trenches until they built some raggedy huts themselves. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm well aware of what Germany did in the war. I'm well aware of how they treated the French when they invaded their country. And I understand that the French were not at all inclined to make the lives of POWs comfortable in any way. But for that very reason, I was even more surprised to hear just how well my Uncle Kurt was treated. In fact, Tante Gerdi, mother of an infant in East Berlin, tried her hardest after the war to save enough of their daily living to send care packages with some chocolate and some tobacco to her husband, until he wrote back to her that this was not necessary at all. Not only did they have chocolate and tobacco on the farm, the quality was also much better. I was surprised and I was grateful, because I really loved my Uncle Kurt very much. And also because he was never a supporter of Hitler and his regime, but instead found himself drafted into a war that he never wanted. It makes me feel so grateful and so appreciative of the US that he was treated so well, even as a prisoner of war. Interestingly, though, the few people here to whom I've told this story were just as confused as me. They had never heard of German prisoners of war in the US. It made me wonder if my uncle's story was an isolated case, a rare occurrence. But that notion was actually far from the truth. Years later, while listening to Radiolab, one of my favorite podcasts, Jad Abumrad and Robert Krulwich, the hosts of the show, shone some light on this story in an episode entitled Nazi Summer Camp. Apparently, towards the end of World War II, there were almost 500,000 prisoners of war in the US, mostly German, but also some Japanese and some Italian soldiers. They were located in every single state except for Vermont, sometimes housed in tent cities or churches or high school gyms, sometimes house and even rodeo grounds until more suitable accommodations could be built. There were over 200 base camps, some of them housing up to 8,000 prisoners. And life in these camps was not bad. People had plenty of food. In fact, they were given so much food that in some cases they could not even finish it all. Though hard work was required, the prisoners were treated well. And during times off, there was even entertainment. Prisoners were given musical instruments, they formed orchestras, there were pottery classes, or, in case of my Uncle Kurt, drawing classes. Of course, not everybody was happy with that. There were people in the population and the media who were quite enraged from the very start about the cushy life of enemy soldiers who were killing the sons of American families in the war abroad. After all, the war took a toll on America as well. But despite growing criticism, the US government held on to their treatment of enemy prisoners of war. The Geneva Conventions had just been signed a little over 10 years before, stating that POWs should be given the same rations and treatments as the soldiers of one's own military. The US abided by these conventions, determined that there should not be a repeat of the gruesomeness of World War I. But of course, we all know that the gruesomeness of World War I was to be overshadowed. We know that Germany did not abide by any laws and conventions. This became clear when US soldiers discovered German prisoners of war camps for American soldiers who were treated cruelly, violently, who were even killed, massacred after surrendering. That Germany did not follow any laws or conventions became even more clear when the concentration camps were discovered. At this point, resources in the US were becoming scarce. Also, in the camps hosting German soldiers, the relative freedom allowed the convinced Nazis, those who were not simply drafted, but who followed Hitler willingly and enthusiastically, to organize themselves, perpetuate their ideologies, and bully prisoners like my Uncle Kurt who did not share their convictions. All of this led to a renewed debate about how many of the scarce resources should be spent on such deplorable people. Should you be fair and humane to those who showed such a blatant disregard for humanity? When push came to shove, there was a vote in Congress, and Congress voted to keep upholding the Geneva Conventions, to keep treating the German prisoners decently. Not only did they say that they didn't want to sink to the same level of Nazis, they did not even want to use Nazis as a standard or a measurement. They decided to stick to their own standards, their own American ideals. And because of that, my Uncle Kurt did not have to suffer. And after some time, he returned safely home. When thinking about that time in American history, when the people here decided to go above and beyond to uphold their ideals, this story always comes to my mind. It really does. I do think this was a choice well made. I don't think it was easy. Upholding one's ideals often is not. Choosing to hold on to one's goodness when faced with such evil is not. But I think it was right, and it fills me with gratitude. But, of course, we also know that during that time, not only good choices were made. Because these camps that hosted the German soldiers were not the only camps during that time. There were also the internment camps where over 100,000 people of Japanese ancestry, the majority of them American citizens, were housed after they were yanked out of their lives simply because their background made them seem like a threat. And the conditions in these camps, sparsely erected wooden buildings that did not keep out the cold or the wind, sometimes not even the rain, where up to 25 people were crammed into rooms designed for 4, where there was often no plumbing, the conditions were bad. Food was scarce and of low quality. Lives were destroyed and harm was done. The ruptures in families and the psychological damage that was done carried forth into the next generation as well. And the harm that was done in these camps was done to civilians, mothers and fathers and children, grandfathers and grandmothers, people like you and me, people who did not fire at American sons on the battlefield and who did not commit genocide. And of course, all of this also happened long before the civil rights movement. So segregation was still rampant in any parts of the US, including the US military. I'm so grateful that my Uncle Kurt was treated so kindly, and also the US treated Nazi soldiers better than many of their own citizens. Because both of this is true. And I think it is undeniable that racism played a part in this. I think what this shows is something that also became apparent again in recent years, that in many parts of America, a white life counts more than the life of a person of color, even when the white life is a Nazi soldier or sympathizer. Holding this hard bit of truth is also an act of love. Now, in the podcast that I mentioned, the hosts also bring up racism. But in addition, they quote Paul Springer, a military historian who raises another reason, not one to replace racism as an explanation for this grave and unjust discrepancy in treatment, but to add to it. He says that one of the main differences was that there were clear rules governing international law, like the Geneva Conventions, when it came to the treatment of war prisoners. The same was not true for American citizens. In fact, even Japanese soldiers who became prisoners of war were treated far better than the American civilians of Japanese ancestry in the internment camps. For them, there were no clear rules. They were in a weird gray zone outside of the law. I say that this explanation is an addition to that of racism because I think they go hand in hand. Within systemic racism, having rules applied to you, laws work in your favor, is not a basic right, but a privilege that not everyone enjoys. And we have seen this time and time again. We have seen this when, after 9/11, the Bush administration announced that people suspected of sympathizing with Al-Qaeda were terrorists, not prisoners of war, and therefore the Geneva Conventions did not apply, leading to the infamous prison camps of Guantanamo Bay. To this day, of the 780 prisoners who were taken at Guantanamo Bay, 27 detainees still remain at camp. They've been held there for nearly 2 decades without a trial. And we've also seen this a few years ago when the Trump administration decided that the rights usually guaranteed to asylum seekers did not apply at the southern border, separating children from their parents, holding people in dehumanizing and cruel conditions, and making a mockery of legal procedure when 3-year-old children were asked to make their case in front of immigration judges. We've seen this when the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882, a law severely restricting immigration to the US, the first law to suddenly do so for one specific group, after centuries of Europeans freely and legally entering the US to start new lives here. We see this every time the police violates people of color, especially Black people, employing measures of drastic and even fatal violence for minor infractions or for even just existing, with often little to no legal consequences for the officers. And of course, we see this in the very juxtaposition of the ideals and values of the Declaration of Independence, with its grand opening promise that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and the fact that from the very start, these rights, these promises were reserved only for white men, excluding women, people of color, and even leaving room for chattel slavery and genocide. And yet, regardless of this exclusion, in his speech, I Have a Dream, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King claims these rights for himself, for people of color, just as much as for white men, as for the white men for which they were originally intended, saying, "This note was a promise to all men. Yes, Black men as well as white men would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring the sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked with insufficient funds." Dr. King does not take issue with the American ideals, but with the inconsistencies of their application. And it is these inconsistencies precisely that have and still do create systems of oppression and of structural racism. It is our duty to alleviate the ongoing injustice that keeps pouring out all of these inconsistencies. What I love about this country is that there are ideals and laws and a promise that allowed for my Uncle Cord, an enemy soldier, to be treated decently and fairly. What breaks my heart and fills me not just with despair, but also with the urgent need to work for change, is the fact that the same ideals, laws, and promises are not fulfilled in the same way for Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the US. Today, on Martin Luther King Day,